is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Chance Bonar, with a talk entitled Anarchism and Pedagogy in the Classics Classroom. Chance is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Humanities at Tufts University and a lecturer in advanced Greek at Harvard Divinity School. His research and teaching focus on early Christianity, slavery in the ancient Mediterranean, representations of violence, and Christian anti-Semitism. So that title again is Anarchism and Pedagogy in the Classics Classroom. Take it away, Chance.
Thank you all so much. I'm very excited to be here with you, and I've really appreciated the talks that we've had so far and the discussion that we'll continue having. Two caveats as I begin. The first is that I'm speaking to you today from unceded Massachusetts, Pawtucket, and Wampanoag land. And I wanted to acknowledge that fact. As well as that I really appreciate the supportive venue that we have here in the midst of my own experience this week with doxing, hate mail, controversy, and cancellation over a panel that I was attempting to run on Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and religious literacy. So it's wonderful to be in an environment where difficult conversations can be had. So I'm going to share my slides and get started here. In the wake of radical pedagogical theory and praxis by Bell Hooks and Paulo Freire, some scholars over the last few decades have explored different ways of incorporating anarchist philosophical and socio-political values into their pedagogical strategies. As an ancient Mediterranean historian and religionist, as well as a co-facilitator of an undergraduate anarchist social theory reading group, my goal in this presentation is to pull together some insights from radical and anarchist pedagogical theory and practice that might be fruitfully applied to the classics classroom, particularly in courses focused on ancient Mediterranean history, myth, or literature. My goal is to explore and offer space for further discussion of how anti-hierarchical, anti-capitalist, and anti-state ideologies, as well as practices of decentralized mutual aid, direct action, and voluntary cooperation might shape how we go about teaching the history and literature of the ancient Mediterranean world. My presentation will consist of 3 parts. The first part offers an overview of anarchist thought and the sometimes precarious place of education and pedagogy within its theoretical and practical boundaries. The second section highlights some of the key strategies that anarchist pedagogues have taken, as well as the successes and failures that they have encountered in navigating neoliberal capitalist university systems. I will especially emphasize some of the more practical or hands-on pedagogical techniques and outcomes that anarchist pedagogues encourage, which bolster students' abilities to participate in community decision-making, mutual aid, student-directed learning, and the development of anti-hierarchical relationships. Finally, I'll turn my attention to my own experience in enacting some of these practices in the classroom setting and beyond, as well as future hopes to do so within the study of the ancient world. And we'll attend to some of what difficulties classicists and ancient historians face when either enacting anarchist pedagogical strategies or discussing anarchist ideals with students. Before going on, I want to note here that my goal is primarily to open a conversation. I'm not an expert in anarchist thought or practice, nor do I fully live out anarchist ideals. I was pulled into this conversation unexpectedly by students who were seeking a faculty member for this reading group. And thinking through the role that anarchism can play in my pedagogy is the least that I owe to the students who seek to actionably produce a more equitable anti-capitalist world, in which their lives are and will be threatened even more so than mine due to climate changes and the multifaceted resurgence of fascism in the 21st century. Anarchist thought is difficult to summarize beyond the plethora of directions in which anarchists think and act, as well as the notion that one can't stipulate too much about a future anarchist utopia without threatening to hinder the freedom of future anarchist practitioners. Anthropologist David Graeber's definition perhaps sums it up best. Quote, "We are talking less about a body of theory than about an attitude, or perhaps one might even say a faith. The rejection of certain types of social relations, the confidence that certain others would be much better ones on which to build a livable society, a belief that such a society could actually exist. Some key features of most anarchist thought include libertarian distribution of power to individuals rather than to states, direct democratic decision-making and voluntary association with one's community, economic self-organization compared to wage slavery, defined as private ownership of the means of production and the salary system, and practices of mutual aid. While often stereotyped as chaotic or violent, much anarchist thought and praxis focuses on refusal to submit to forms of illegitimate authority, particularly the state, and has been unwittingly enacted in recent years, such as through instances of mutual aid occurring globally at the height of the COVID pandemic. Even for those who don't see themselves as diehard anarchists, anarchist thinkers like George Woodcock have argued that while the anarchist movement stalled in the 20th century and may not reach the ideals it sought after, we have to still do what we can to, quote, preserve as much freedom as possible for people as they are, end quote, and use pieces of anarchist thought in our current world. The relationship between anarchism and education has historically been tense and sometimes has existed on the fringes of anarchist thought because of radical pedagogy's neo-Marxist roots. The work of Freire, Giroux, and Hooks in questioning the status quo of pedagogic power in the classroom and claims to objectivity set the stage for further analysis, praxis, and critique. Additionally, other theorists paved the way for anarchist pedagogical thought. Foucault, in his comparison of the function of schools to prisons, Althusser's critique of schools within capitalistic societies as reproducing bourgeois values, Bourdieu's treatment of the weaponization of academic credentials and educational access as cultural capital. And as scholar Abraham de Leon puts it, quote, critical pedagogy and its role in engendering critique and resistance has played a vital role in developing radical theory in education, but needs to be infused with anarchist notions of direct action and critiques of the state, end quote. In other words, what distinguishes anarchist pedagogy from other forms of radical pedagogy is, to varying degrees, its desire not only to challenge the state's role in or influence over education, but to abolish it altogether. Many anarchist thinkers have and do express a heavy skepticism of educational institutions, seeing them as perpetuating the bourgeoisie and pretending to offer upward mobility while doing nothing more than maintaining traditional class divisions. Anarchist pedagogical thinkers express concern over one issue in the 21st century in particular, the effects of capitalism on pedagogical strategies, goals, and institutions. As Robert Hayworth puts it, quote, there's a critical need to realize anarchism within an educational context in order to provide alternatives to the intensive shifts to universalize global capitalism at all levels of society, end quote. These shifts refer to the standardization of curricula, commodification and concern over the employability of knowledge, and privatization of public institutions, with which Hayworth refers to as microfascisms. And perhaps the best summary, as well as the best sweater, of the anxiety experienced by the anarcho-pedagogue, among many, many others, can be expressed by Derek Jensen's quote, got for it here. Quote, I hate industrial schooling because it commits one of the only unforgivable sins there is. It leads people away from themselves, training them to be workers and convincing them it's in their best interests to be ever more loyal slaves, rowing the galley that is industrial civilization ever more fervently. I participate in this process. I help make school a little more palatable, a little more fun, as students are trained to do their part in the ongoing destruction of the planet, as they enter the final phases of trading their birthright as the free and happy humans that they were born to be for their role as cogs in the giant industrial machine, or worse, as overseers of the giant factory/enslavement camp we once recognized as the living Earth. Doesn't that make me, in essence, a collaborator? Hell, drop the in essence. End quote. Given how colonialism, capitalism, and fascism have the capacity to work hand in hand in anarchist critique to standardize and domesticate those being schooled within and often by lower classes. Some anarchist thinkers urge to distinguish true education from state-run and or private educational institutions. Others go even further, calling for abolition of schools so as to focus on new educational systems based on free association and skill exchange. Education occurring exclusively outside of the traditional classroom, offered by those who have some knowledge or skill they want to share, and received by those who have some knowledge or skill they would like to learn more about. In his work on what education might look like beyond hierarchical or state-based classrooms, Joseph Todd points us to three key aspects for any development of anarcho-pedagogy: the individual, the community, and the structure. Accordingly, I'll talk about each of these three and then note difficulties that anarcho-pedagogues have faced in implementing their approach. The individual aspect focuses on student-directed learning, active learning, and students' autonomy. Anarcho-pedagogues urge for mutual learning and student participation in deciding what material is learned, attempting as best as possible to create egalitarian student-teacher relations that wholly disrupt the banking model critiqued by Freire. Such an educational approach focuses on curiosity rather than command, presuming that everyone is capable of curiosity, teaching, and learning. Some, like Alejandro de Acosta, question whether our definition of teaching is even possible. If we presume that teaching is the communication of information, like in the banking model, then a teacher is not necessary to transmit that information and is replaceable. But if a teacher models behaviors and practices, as we inevitably do, she argues that we, quote, exceed the role of the teacher as traditionally formulated. She suggests that in our focus on the individual, not only to remove barriers for minoritized people to access colleges, but allow the individual's desire for learning and social change to shape curricula and to be honest about what when those desires are beyond what colleges can offer. In regard to the communal aspect, anarcho-pedagogues urge fostering community in and beyond the college environment. As Joe Kernow puts it, quote, more often than not, people become politicized through engagement in communities where particular political analyses and actions are valued and performed collectively, end quote. That is, when people are mutually engaged, co-construct meaning, and learn from one another's experiences and skills, they tend to become more politically literate and active. Jeffrey Schultz suggests that a communal pedagogical focus should highlight the importance of anarchist and activist practices like meetings, organizing, and debates, since they are key skills for collaboration, expression of autonomy, and negotiation. A key text that anarcho-pedagogues suggest reading is Kropotkin's Mutual Aid, particularly since he provides an alternative to social Darwinism, while the latter suggests that competition is at the heart of evolution and applies this biological concept to social theory. Kropotkin argues that animal survival and evolution depends more on collaboration and voluntary cooperation. Regarding structure, anarcho-pedagogues exhibit distrust of state education, bureaucracy, and capitalist privatization of education. The response is something along the lines of Ivan Illich's proposal for deschooling, forms of homeschooling or communal education that, as Justin Mueller summarizes it, is, quote, part of the very practice and prefiguration of the anarchist ideal of creating freer and more critical minds, more open, cooperative, and non-oppressive relationships within society, end quote. For some, this aspect of critiquing current educational structures involves what Abraham de Leon calls epistemological sabotage, dismissing state standardization, the use of textbooks, and instead exploring alternative histories that allow students to consider methods of resistance. Other anarchist projects, like the Escuela Moderna in 20th century Catalonia, aim not toward vocational or abstract learning, but allowed students to explore factories, museums, gardens, and community spaces to learn through exposure and practice, through the exchange of skills and knowledge. Of course, there are plenty of obstacles to anarcho-pedagogy. One of the most prominent is how education under global capitalism often functions with the primary goal of employability, which drives both curricular content and metrics. Stephanie Spotto, for example, has argued that states like California have spent more money on prisons than colleges in recent decades, in part because our classrooms not only turn students into, quote, productive members of the consumer economy, but educate them for complacency in the face of state violence and mass incarceration, end quote. And as we all know very well, it's extremely hard to convince college students to consider classics or ancient history as a major, given the pressures of employability and perceptions regarding a soft discipline outside of the current configurations of STEM and computer science, even though students often express interest in classics and ancient history courses. Additionally, many of us educators become trapped in the logics of employability, trying to show how classics courses or majors go on to become lawyers, doctors, work at NGOs, etc. Understandably, this is work that we need to do to get by and keep our jobs. And at the same time, anarcho-pedagogy urges us to more actively challenge the aim of producing efficient and productive members of capitalist society and allow more space for skill and knowledge exchange based on individual interest and desire rather than the needs of employers. Beyond employability, anarcho-pedagogues point to other perennial issues, that we can never fully escape the teacher-student power dynamic and hence can only be anti-hierarchical rather than non-hierarchical. That students in classrooms shaped by anarchist approaches sometimes express a lack of motivation due to the missing pressures of deadlines, grades, or punitive measures. And whether continuing to work in the university at all is inevitably selling out, or whether, as Catherine Von Stockton has put it, many scholars still buy into a concept of trickle-down theory, that if you expose students to readings about revolutionary theory, that this will magically change the classroom and continue to seep into broader society. Curricular changes, anarcho-pedagogues suggest, need to be accompanied by direct action so as to avoid collapsing when students are faced with the pressures that exist beyond the walls of the classroom. Finally, let's turn to anarchist pedagogy in the classics classroom, what's been done, the few things I've tried, and some possibilities to try out. The one published account of an attempt to implement anarchist pedagogy in ancient studies that I found comes out of Stellenbosch University in South Africa, but a 2021 course on Aramaic linguistics focused on conducting research and producing a publishable article by the end of the course. The authors discuss how anarchist values like fraternity, solidarity, mutual aid, compassion, and joy were expressed in and beyond the classroom. In the description of the semester itself, students discussed Aramaic linguistics alongside theoretical literature about their own South African languages, shared drafts of ideas, met for an article editing retreat at a beach house, and emphasized the importance of reflection, self-criticism, and active learning. The lecturer also attempted to enact the ideal of voluntary association by making the course an elective, so that it stood outside of the traditional curricular expectations and requirements, and thus allowed for a free choice to join. I think that's a good start, and that more can be done to enact anarchist pedagogical ideals to varying degrees. Some of us already enact anarchist ideals through practices of self-grading or ungrading as a way to challenge metric fixation. Something that I've been practicing is the co-creation of my syllabus with students, in which I offer a list of readings on the topic and allow students to dictate which of these readings we'll pursue throughout the semester. This was inspired by the Escuela Libre Paideia, an anarchist primary school in southwestern Spain that gives students multiple options of what to learn so as to foster individual autonomy and feed students' desires and interests. The two times that I've done this, once in an introduction to the Bible and once in ancient slavery and its modern legacies, students tended toward readings on disability studies, which has inspired me to more deeply explore disability studies for myself in my research and craft an outline of a health, illness, and disability in the ancient Mediterranean syllabus. Part of these possible readings, as well as a short reflection assignment, include analysis of socialist, communist, or anarchist thinkers in the 19th and 20th centuries, and how they talked about slavery and labor in antiquity. My goal here is to explore how anti-capitalists and some anti-state writers are part of the history of classical reception, as well as how such perspectives and reading strategies allow for different foci when studying marginalized people in antiquity and caring for marginalized people today. A helpful starting point I've been working with is A People's History of Classics, an AHRC-funded research project run by Edith Hall, and of course, the incredible work of working classicists in making available resources and information to recognize that classics happens beyond the walls of private institutions. The skills and knowledge that we co-create with students in the classics classroom allows us to address the more recent histories and contemporary concerns as well. My ancient slavery course has 4 planned field trips attached to it, 2 that focus on antiquity, the MFA Boston and Harvard Art Museums, and 2 on modernity, the Royal House and Slave Quarters, which is the only plantation in the northern states, and the Freedom Trail in Boston. Since my class has students working on museum studies minors, I wanted to support their interests through analysis of curation material culture. Additionally, our visit to the Royal House encouraged students to consider the long legacies of slavery right under their feet, that by the 1730s, Isaac Royal, a trafficker, enslaver, and rum distiller, built a house that still stands today on part of his 500-acre property, some of which eventually became the land that Tufts University is built upon. My goal in such classics and ancient history courses is to urge students away from the temporal and textual abstractness of ancient slavery and toward the continued ways that slavery and unfree labor occur. I've added some short readings by communists and anarchists, including Anton Pannekoek's Worker Councils, Peter Kropotkin's Mutual Aid, and David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs, to further encourage analysis of what makes for a mutually supportive society and how to manage the complexity of defining labor and leisure in their own worlds. Students in my ancient slavery class expressed surprise at the similarities between ancient enslaved overseers, that is, the Vilikus, described in agronomic literature, and anarchist and communist concerns regarding bureaucracy and management strategies in antiquity and modernity. And something that I haven't attempted yet, but want to think about further, is Stephanie Spato's suggestion that anarchist pedagogy, or really any radical pedagogy, must be paired with direct action. For example, strikes, occupations, blockades, vigils, petitions, marches, boycotts, or mutual aid. While I participate in many of these activities on my own, some of these are trickier than others to accomplish in most of our university settings. Not many administrators would be thrilled about requiring or even asking students to participate in strikes for a grade. But there are likely ways that participation in direct action could be one of multiple options for a course assignment or final project, in which a student later reflects on both the direct action they participated in and how it connects to the course materials and discussion. As Lucy Nicholas argues in her examination of how anarchist pedagogy melds with queer and post-structural theories that seek the maximal allowance of autonomy for human flourishing, part of the anarcho-pedagogue's goal in doing culture work that changes people's behaviors, attitudes, and norms should be about changing laws. The practice of being in community with and in direct conversation with others, attempting to actionably change our current world, takes a step beyond trickle-down theory and allows for students and ourselves to continue to shape and be shaped by those beyond the classroom. And certainly what anarchist pedagogy would look like would differ depending on one's university setting, geographical location, and other factors. In his description of anarchist pedagogy, Farhang Rouhani notes that his own context in a small liberal arts college in a small city, the University of Mary Washington, shaped how the anarchist social theory club on campus accomplished particular workshops, speaker series, worker organizing, and participation in local protests. Likewise, Stephanie Spoto noted that any anarchist project at a university will be unique and not fully replicable elsewhere. And for good reason, because the type of actions and communities built should depend on student-driven and community-driven needs. So there's plenty more that can be said or explored regarding how anarchism might shape our pedagogies, and I hope that this is a hopeful starting point to think through how classes that on the outside might seem to be exclusively about the events and languages of millennia ago might attend even more intentionally to contemporary concerns about how society is run and how to contribute to human flourishing. Thank you.